My dad was a bomber pilot in World War II, and he lied about his age to join the Royal Air Force in 1941, just in case the war ended before he could do his bit. And soon enough, he was in command of a crew of 7, a forbidding 4-engine Lancaster, flying out across Nazi-occupied Europe to drop bombs on Germany. And he was still just a boy of 18. 1 in 2 bomber crews perished. And the average lifespan of a Lancaster, 3 weeks. But my dad and his crew and his trusty Lancaster S for sugar defied the odds to fly several years of perilous bombing missions. Dad's war stories left a lasting impression on me. But when he died in 1993, relatively young, the internet was just in its infancy. And it would be 15 years before I came to understand how it might be used to share stories that could change or even save lives. It was May 2008. Roger, my husband, and I were in a dark place. Kick-started by an act of betrayal, our once stable business of 22 years was plummeting toward a messy end. A quick million seemed like a solution, so when I picked up a book about internet entrepreneurs making millions with a free offer of tickets to an upcoming seminar, we jumped at it. I'm sure some of you may have experienced similar events, the sort at which you would sell your soul for the real secret to boundless wealth. But we had nonetheless been exposed to the intoxicating potential for the internet to open doors, and we came home drunk with ideas. Now, I belong to a little-known diaspora and a family separated across 4 continents. Our two daughters are both 5th-generation Africans, born in the same city and country. Our elder in Harare, Zimbabwe, Salisbury, Rhodesia, and our younger in Harare, Zimbabwe. So our early parenthood coincided with the birth of the new nation Zimbabwe in 1980. It was a time of upheaval, and for us, characterized by an endless round of burglaries. I'd like you to imagine it's 2 a.m, I'm heavily pregnant. Our little girl is asleep across the corridor, and we wake with a knife at our throats and a threat to kill us. So we spent our time sharing similar horror stories and saying goodbye to everybody as they left. And eventually we too left everything behind to start again in Australia in 1984, while my loved younger aunt, Rhonda, and her family moved to South Africa. In June 2008, Rhonda paid us a visit. We talked non-stop about Africa, and she told us something about the issue of children orphaned as a result of losing a parent to HIV/AIDS. She kept blankets in her car to hand out to these kids that she found on the side of the road at night, alone and cold. We were haunted. One such child found in those circumstances should be headline news. More than one was unthinkable. My mother is never without knitting needles in her hands. And she had just made us a beautiful blanket made of squares. So out of these seemingly unrelated events, the seminar, Rhonda's visit, and my mother's gift, and my memory of the small children of Africa, was born a very humble intent. What if, to test my new knowledge about the internet, I could put up a website that asked the world's knitters to knit a square and send it to Rhonda? She could sew them together and hand out warmer handmade blankets to these desperate children. we had a chat and decided it was a good idea. So I bought the domain knittersquare.com and very soon realized that nothing was so simple as had been made out at the seminar. I spent months in every spare moment trying to figure out how the internet worked and learned some very important lessons. Real connection online is not random. It's intent-driven and cause-related. And the vehicle for it is a constant flow of purposeful stories. I also discovered thousands of knitters who wanted to knit for charity. So if I could direct them to the website, could I also persuade them to knit a square for an orphan? I needed to communicate the scale and desperation of the children's plight, so my research shifted to the issue itself, and it revealed an almost unimaginable tragedy. In despair, I wondered how it was possible that I and the world were unaware of the statistics that tell of a child losing a parent every 15 seconds. That's 72 new orphans during this talk alone. 22 million children and babies abandoned and orphaned as the combined peril of HIV/AIDS, stigma and poverty encircle the lives of people all over the continent. Richard Stearns, the CEO of World Vision, said, "I well believe that this could be looked back upon as the sin of our generation, and our children 40 to 50 years from now are going to say, 'What did you do?' while 40 million children became orphaned in Africa." But it was a story I found of a young girl recently orphaned, told by Stephen Lewis, who had been the United Nations Special Envoy for HIV/AIDS to Africa. He said he'd witnessed many such stories before, but that none had left him in such disarray. And that is this young girl told of the death of her mother just a few days before. She wept copiously and uncontrollably. He said it was as if her weeping plumbed the depths of the sea. Her tears didn't just flow, they gushed, they ran down her sweater and soaked her skirt. And for a moment in time, it was as if this one young girl was the pandemic incarnate. That story changed our lives and my despair to a driving intent. Intention fuels passion and creativity and energy. And so Roger and I started to write feverishly against every search term I could find about knitting and crochet and patterns and HIV/AIDS and Africa and the children. And on every page we exhorted the knitters to pick up their needles, knit a square and send it to Rhonda. And soon knitters started to find the site and a few parcels arrived. Do you remember the lessons? Intent-driven, cause-related, purposeful stories. Well, it worked, because then a vast door opened for us when the United States' largest yarn manufacturer found the site, read it, and featured us as the charity of the month. And they had 1 million knitters on their database. The website had 150,000 hits. And my inbox was inundated with requests to help. Could they send hats, toys, jumpers, books? Could they volunteer? I was caught completely unprepared. I responded over 3 weeks to every email, deeply moved that they cared. And the trickle of parcels turned into a deluge. And for years, my aunt's house, a warehouse. When Rhonda wrapped the first blanket around a small disabled orphan boy, people who saw the video wrote from around the world, so grateful that they could make a difference simply by knitting a square. And as we saw that we could empower people to make a difference, and that the blankets actually warmed and comforted children who were often very ill themselves, and this gave solace to their carers, that this was no longer an idea, it was real. Maybe even a movement, because the squares had become a currency of hope. And we now had to respond to the momentum of a rapidly growing community, so our intention shifted to supporting them and sharing the stories. We told them about Rhonda's tireless efforts to gather together huge-hearted volunteers to process the mountain of squares, sew and distribute the blankets. We told them about the grandmothers who'd often buried their own children and were sole carers of their grandchildren who banded together to sew the blankets. We shared with them their own compassionate craft work and their creative challenges designed to inspire more members and greater contributions. We took them on the journey as Rhonda and her volunteers entered the sprawling and sometimes dangerous shack settlements that surround the major cities, where they distributed the blankets into these tiny, sparse little daycare centres that have mushroomed everywhere by the hundred, run by enterprising women to look after the needs of the children. And every time a blanket is wrapped around a small child, we are reminded to keep caring, and they're told, you're unique and you have a role to play in your country. Back in Australia, we were overtaken by the momentum of it all. Encouraged by a tutor from the US, we raced to complete a teacher resource, because if we could introduce Knit a Square into the schools, surely we would raise awareness amongst a generation that would act. Online volunteers rose like cream to the surface. The idea spread. In 2012, a woman started her own program in Turkey and has supplied 16,000 blankets to Syrian refugee children. Even sailors on the mighty aircraft carrier, the USS Enterprise, wrote of their Knit a Square program on board. That's a compelling contrast. Warriors of the sea, knitting for orphans half a world away. Knit a Square has received more than 1 million squares, hats, toys and jumpers from an estimated community around the world in 55 countries. It's now in the hands of a wonderful band of women who look after it, care for it, and keep it growing. Knit a Square taught me a great deal. It remains my most exacting teacher. We'd lost our home and our livelihood, but we were saved by the love of our family, and that must always remind me what these orphans have lost. It taught me that the internet could be used to galvanize compassion and action, and that when it mattered, everyone was a storyteller. And they tell their stories deliberately to inspire hope and courage and a conviction to act. A young woman who shared her story saved our grandchild's life. She'd given birth without any warning to her son 15 weeks early. And when our daughter was 20 weeks pregnant, she tuned in to some unusual symptoms. And because of this story, she had the courage to ask for a test, which revealed that, likely because of a previous medical procedure, her baby was at risk of imminent delivery. A lot of medical intervention followed, 12 weeks in hospital, 12 weeks strict bed rest, and 5 in hospital. And an entry into a neonatal intensive care unit when her small baby was born 8 weeks preterm. Now, it's hard to imagine a time more fearful than the prospect of losing your child. And throughout that long 18 weeks, it was the little stories that the doctors and midwives shared that kept her hope alive. As we reflect on this beautiful child's growth. We often remember the story that saved her life by 1 millimeter. So I said to my daughter, can you share this story online so that you might spare other people your experience and even the lives of unborn babies? A blog post doesn't gather dust on a bookshelf or disappear into cyberspace like a social media update. It's there for as long as we live in a world to power the internet. I often think about my dad and the moment when sitting on his knee as a little girl, he realized he'd dropped bombs on girls just like me. What could he have taught the world about youthful courage and resilience in the face of a realization like that? If he'd been alive, I'd have taught him to share those stories online. Just as the young woman who shared her story spared our granddaughter's life. And the doctors and midwives kept hope alive in dark times. The story of Knit Square demonstrates that at the intersection of intention and compassion and stories, communities gather, and with such communities, what we can do is yet to be imagined. Are you a custodian of such a story? How might you use your story to find and engage the people who most need to hear it? How might your stories enrich or change or even save lives? Thank you.